19. There's so much in this portion, it's almost hard to pick what exactly to talk about, so I'm going to try to talk about everything. Isn't that how it works? No, I'm going to focus on these things here, these three pictures of the Messiah that are in this one portion alone, this one section alone. So definitely have your Bibles open because I don't have all of the scriptures up. But when you look at Numbers 19, hello, something happened there. Dating this is the date for this has been some debate, some discussion, difficulty. It's hard to place. Is it at the beginning of their wilderness wandering or is it at the end? I'm kind of going with the idea. I tend to think that it's more about the end of their time. So they've had 38 years of being out in the wilderness. They've had 38 years of people dying out in the tents. So when you look at Numbers 19, let's read 1 through 13. It says, Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, This is the statute of the Torah, which Adonai commanded, saying, Speak to Bnei Israel, that they bring to you a flawless red heifer on which there is no blemish, and on which has never been a yoke. Give her to Eleazar the Cohen, and he will take her outside the camp and slaughter her in his presence. Then Eleazar the Cohen is to take some of the blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. When you think about this, I'm going to stop there for just a moment. When you think about it, so they've had 38 years of people dying out there in the wilderness. And we're talking how many thousands of fighting men? We're talking over 600,000 fighting men who are going to be there in that generation. That's not including the women from that generation that also would have died in the wilderness. They would have come in contact with many people who were dead. Presumably, some would have died in their tents, right? This is an issue that they would have had ongoing all this time. But so before they can really enter into the land, they have to have a way of cleansing from all that death that made them unclean. And of course, being unclean is different from being in sin, right? You can be blameless, so to speak. You can not have done anything wrong, but still be unclean. But they did have this instruction from the Torah to do so. So they had this red heifer that we've been reading about. Verse 5, he picks back up. He says, While watching, he is to burn the heifer, her hide, flesh, blood, and refuse. The Cohen is to take some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool, and cast them into the midst of the burning heifer. Afterward, the Cohen is to wash his clothes and bathe his flesh with the water, and afterward he may come back into the camp. Still, the Cohen will be unclean until evening. Also, the one burning it is to wash his clothes and bathe his flesh with the water, and he will be unclean until evening. A clean man is to gather up the ashes of the heifer and put them in a clean place outside of the camp, and they are to be for the community of Bnei Israel to use as water of purification from sin. So that's one of the purposes of it. The one who gathers the heifer's ashes is also to wash his clothes as well as to be unclean until evening. It will be a permanent statute for Bnei Israel and for the outsider living among them. Whoever touches any dead body will be unclean for 7 days. He is to purify himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd and 7th days, he will not be clean. And anyone touching the dead body of any man who does not purify himself defiles Adonai's tabernacle, and that person will be cut off from Israel. Because the cleansing water was not sprinkled on him, he is unclean, and his uncleanness will remain on him. So, this first picture, that of this red heifer, there's a whole lot of stuff written about this. There's a whole lot of stuff that's unknown about this, just trying to make sense of it all. But when you look at this red heifer, the word is Adon, and it's related to another character in Scripture. His name is Edom, right, which talks about him being red, but it's also still related to and connected to, it's very similar to Adam, which has that sense of earthiness, that sense of redness and such. So it's connected to both, but it's connected to Adam as well. It's talking about somebody, this heifer that is flawless, which means it's uncorrupted, which means it's essentially innocent. It has no blemish on it. It's not been hurt or it's not been injured. The one that really struck me was the idea of it being not having a yoke upon it. So it's never been broken into field work, so to speak. It's never had to carry a load or labor. That yoke is necessary to work the ground. In order to break the ground, in order to plant and process your fields and things like that, you've got to have one of these strong animals to be able to break the surface of the ground. Of course, working the ground is part of what that was given to Adam. It goes all the way back to the curse, back in Genesis chapter 3. So figuratively, this red heifer, it's as if it has never borne the weight of the curse. It has never had to work the ground like Adam had. So thinking back to Genesis 3 and that connection, this is, how many animals did God sacrifice in order to provide garments of skin for them? It doesn't say, but we've always kind of assumed one, right? Now, here's the thing. Does it say what kind of animal it was? What comes to mind when you typically think about it? What kind of animal? We usually think of a lamb, right? Now, how much skin is on a lamb? Not a lot. And so, and the way I always picture this going back to childhood and such like that, when I have this minimalist picture in my mind of what they were wearing, thanks to all those artists' drawings and pictures in your Bibles and Sunday school literature. So, Adam is just like wearing a loincloth, and she's wearing barely enough to cover herself, so they're mostly still exposed themselves. That's how we've always pictured it. Anybody else have that picture? The kind of almost a caveman kind of art, minimalist clothing? Well, that might work if you have a very small animal. You might have to do that. But, the skin of one ram might not be enough to really fully cover both of them. So what if the sacrifice was something larger? I kind of wonder if the offering that was made there to clothe them, I wouldn't be surprised if it was something like this red heifer, to be able to provide enough covering for the two of them. But again, that's speculation on my part, but it's still just it's an interesting concept. This red heifer was taken outside of the camp. Hello, I didn't think I had those in there. It was taken outside the camp. It was taken out. Its blood was taken out and sprinkled 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. So it's talked about in the sense of having almost this direct line of sight in order to be able to see the tent of meeting. And so then within that, it says in verse 6 that they're supposed to take some cedar wood, some hyssop, and scarlet wool, and cast them into the midst of the burning heifer. Does anybody recognize what those are, or where else those are used? Yeah, well, it's at the crucifixion. Yes, there are elements of that there, but also Passover, and also there in Leviticus 14 with the cleansing of the leper specifically. The only thing that's missing about this from the leprosy issue was a bird. That was 2 birds actually that were used in this. One bird was sacrificed, one was released at the end of that ceremony. So these are elements that are pictured multiple times. But they are essential for the process of making the unclean leper with this tza'arat clean. It's also essential for the home that has the tza'arat in it, the leprosy in it, or the uncleanness in it. These elements were essential for that. They were to the person with tza'arat in many ways, especially with the way that we tend to picture it. They had essentially death on the surface of their skin. Oftentimes we think of it as that this is dying tissue. It's typically in those sense of the evil speech, the lashon hara, where it's from out of the heart that the mouth speaks. And so the presence of the Mishkan, the presence of God in their camp is bringing all of this uncleanness, all of this evil, all of this death to the surface, and that's what we call the leprosy or the tzarat. So the heart of sin and death is being revealed on the surface. And if you remember Miriam, she had the tzarat, she had the leprosy for how many days? For 7 days. Before she was declared clean, because she was speaking evil against Moses. So this tzarat was the death coming to the surface, the sin and death of their hearts coming to the surface. In a home, this was a picture of death and corruption in the home. Picturing that revealing of the hidden sins that has got to be dealt with before a home can truly be livable. That we need these moments where revealing those things that don't belong in our house, don't belong in our lives. And tradition says that this practice revealed a lot of many secret hideaways or places in the walls where there were idols or even treasure, items that needed to be removed, or items of things that might have been dedicated to God when they even captured that land or that house. So God was using the mold of the house and all those types of things to reveal what needed to be removed. So this tzarat, this leprosy, is a picture of death and decay on or in the midst of something that is living. But that's stuff that could be covered. That's something that could be examined and pronounced clean. But it truly takes the miracle of God for the tzarat to be removed, for the tzarat to be healed. That's why Moses, he would put his hand into his coat, and what would happen? It would come out with leprosy on it, right? So can God give and take leprosy away in a moment? Yes. He was using it as a sign. His hand was cured when he obeyed by putting it back in there and removing it again. It was healed. There was a healing of leprosy with that Gentile general named Naaman in 2 Samuel chapter 5, when he dipped in the Jordan 7 times. See, I'm following way behind on all of this stuff. But without the miracle of God, nothing could really be done about this leprosy. It was something that was believed that only the Messiah would be able to fix, which of course Yeshua did. Yeshua did heal those who had leprosy. He healed them, and then he told them to go and show themselves to the priests. And the scriptures talk about it as a testimony to them. These men had been walking around with this leprosy. They've been walking around in a body of death and decay with no hope that it would ever change. And isn't that really what our situation is? In reality, that is who we are by nature, being born in that lineage of Adam, being born in sin. That's how Paul argued about it. He said, "For I delight in the Torah of God with respect to the inner man, but I see a different law in my body, battling against the law of my mind and bringing me into bondage under the law of sin, which is in my body parts." He says, "Miserable man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death?" He says, "Thanks be to God, it is through Messiah Yeshua our Lord. So then, with my mind I myself serve the Torah of God, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin." It's almost as if it's that Paul is talking about a body that is completely covered with leprosy, that has no hope of ever being declared clean, of forever being outside the camp, of forever being not included as the congregation of God's people, because he is dead. He has death all over him. He may still be walking around. He may still be conscious enough to know that, man, that my situation is dire, and nothing is going to change about it. But when the Messiah comes, when he comes and heals us, when he cleanses us of the leprosy, that stench and covering of death that plagues us, that's when everything changes. And so that leprosy and death are connected in that. The red heifer offering was essential. Was essential for a person who, it says it was supposed to be used in verse 9 to use as water of purification from sin. It was supposed to be used whenever somebody came in contact with the dead, so they might be able to re-enter the community. It was essential to be able to have the death dealt with. Now, the Mishnah, the book of rabbinic commentary, it relates that the ceremony of this red heifer was enacted only 9 times in history. They have it recorded happening only 9 times. Once by Moses, once by Ezra during the first temple, 7 times during the second temple period by the high priest. And to me that sounds kind of strange, because you would think they would have to do this more often, since death and dying was a part of existence. They were a lot closer to it than we are, right? We try to sanitize death and dying. We have other people do it for us a lot of times. We're not always as close especially as they were. But death was a frequent part of life. And so the red heifer, allowed people, it made a way for people to re-enter among the living. It's a picture of someone who is moving from death to life and being able to re-enter. To enter into the presence of the living one. To re-enter into the presence of a holy God. That's what the red heifer made possible for them. Now, when you think about it, is the red heifer really enough to enter into God's presence? If you just had that, are you good? No. Okay, so it's a picture of something greater. It's a picture of something more necessary. It takes even more to really re-enter into His community. It takes the blood of Messiah. It takes the blood of Messiah to do that. Without the Messiah, we are completely cut off from Him. As verse 13 says, anyone touching the dead body of any man who does not purify himself defiles Adonai's tabernacle, His presence. And that person will be cut off from Israel, because the cleansing water was not sprinkled on him. He is unclean, and his uncleanness will remain on him. Right? You're not coming into the Lord's presence so long as you still have that stench of death upon you. Without the Messiah, are we allowed in His presence? No, we're not. We are cut off from Him. So if we refuse, these people, they have the option. Are they going to go in and go through the ceremony of being cleansed by the red heifer? If they don't do that, then they don't get to come back. In the same way, if we have the option of believing in Messiah, if we believe in Messiah, we are entering into the community. We are allowed into the presence of God. But if we refuse to receive Messiah's blood on our behalf, are we getting in? No. No, we're not. The door, we will be cut off, and that doorway will be forever clothed by death. See? Where did that go? Pictures from moving from death to life. But when you look at it, the red heifer was not enough. Hebrews 9, for if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself without blemish to God, will cleanse our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. That's where we're at. The red heifer is not enough. It's just a picture of what Messiah was going to do for us, to bring us back into His presence. But when you look at this, they've been in the desert for these 38 years or so. How many from that generation are still left at this point? Not very many. when you come to some of these stages, you know for certain that there are 5. Joshua and Caleb, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. There are 3 left to go. You know, that came after the Israelites refused to enter the land, and that punishment was declared. But what was said all the way back then, 38 years ago, was said that only Joshua and Caleb would enter the land. Right? Didn't it say that? Shouldn't that have been a clue to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam? Or did they just assume that they were exempt from that? That's kind of a challenging thing there. If only Caleb and Joshua were getting in, that includes them in somehow or another. So in Numbers chapter 20, gives us the deaths of both Miriam in verse 1 and Aaron in verse 27. You know, Miriam, she only gets a very brief mention, and Aaron's is only a little longer, you know, with some info on it that he was on top of Mount Hor and that they were mourning about him for 30 days. Now you think about them. These 2 had been pillars in the community since they left Egypt. And some of Moses' greatest supporters. You know, at least since early on they had a couple of hiccups, right? When they were coming against him a little bit. But they were some of his greatest supporters, and everybody would have mourned them. Many, at least the women, would have likely been a part of the preparation of Miriam's body and all of that as part of the mourning process. They would have been made unclean because of all that. Of course, you know, that's what the red heifer was all about bringing them back in, being made clean, which is that picture of Messiah. But so we have the second picture in this section of the Messiah, and that is the water from the rock. Now let's read verse 1. It says, in the first month, the entire community of Bnei Israel arrived in the wilderness of Zin. The people stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, if only we had died when our brothers died before Adonai. Now why have you brought the community of Adonai into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us from Egypt to bring us to this evil place, a place without grain, fig, grapevine, and pomegranate? There is no water to drink. So Moses and Aaron went before the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Then the glory of Adonai appeared to them. And Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and gather the assembly, you and your brother Aaron, and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will give out its water. You will bring out water from the rock, and you will give the community something to drink, along with their livestock. So, stop there for a minute. You know, Miriam has died, and then the water. Then suddenly, all of a sudden, they don't have water. Now, some connection will make a connection there, like Rashi in the 11th century. You know, they believe that they always had water, as the thing goes, because of the merit of Miriam, that it was her virtue that they had water. And I kind of have some issues with that. Now that she's dead, they no longer have that. To me, that sounds almost very Catholic. You know, this is 11th century, so Catholicism has been around. You know, that they have this supply of water because of Miriam's supply of grace. Now, to me, that sounds like that abundance of grace that can be poured out in those lacking. I don't know when that teaching came out, but He is the one. The Lord is the one who fills our cup to overflowing. He is the one that is our supply. It wasn't her virtue. It was always His grace. It was always His provision that provided that for them. He was providing the water and the manna and all of those things for the people, even when she wasn't always the most virtuous, when she did then oppose Moses. So he was already doing that before some of those things came about. But here's the question: is her death significant? Yes. Absolutely. And I believe in many ways, Miriam was one of those that held the people together, kept them unified, cut off many of the problems before they started. Because, after number 17, the budding of Aaron's staff, there is not another account of the Israelites grumbling against Moses for 38 years. There's not another mention of them having a problem until just after she dies. So it's almost like and I think a picture of her role, that she must have been like, look, if you want to get to Moses, you're going to have to go through me. And I kind of suspect that nobody wanted to go around her, go through her, or go to try to mess with her, in any way mess with Miriam. And rather than an adversary at times toward Moses, I believe she became his advocate, essentially like his protector, which was her original role in his life when you go back to when he was born. She was the one that watched over him when the basket was in the reeds. She was the one that went and spoke to the Egyptian and said, hey, would you want me to go get a Hebrew woman to nurse this child? She was the one that was watching over him that whole time. Her death isn't so much about the water as it was her role as an intercessor and protector of Moses. And that just seems to be a more significant thing, because as soon as she dies, then all of a sudden everything starts back up again. All the grumbling starts going all over again. And that interpretation of the water doesn't seem to be what they believed in the New Testament era. It doesn't seem to focus on Miriam. See, I've got all these things in here. Why do I do this? She became his advocate. But the New Testament era, we see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. They were all immersed into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Messiah. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, for they were struck down in the desert. Now these things happened as examples for us, so we wouldn't crave evil things just as they did. So, what was the cause? What was the source of the water? Was it Miriam, according to Paul? No. The rock was Messiah. He was with them all along. He was providing for them all along. It was him who was that rock on their behalf. The living water flowed out from Messiah. And it was enough to provide for several million people, probably several million animals. Miriam doesn't provide the water, neither does Moses or Aaron, which is part of the problem. Verse 10, that's almost how they speak. Some of the way the rabbis and such teach this is that the sin resulted from Moses saying the notzi, that shall we draw forth the water, as if they had the power to do that themselves. When he should have said yotzi, which meaning shall he draw forth, giving credit to God in that moment. It's almost as if Moses acted as if God's provision needed a little help, a little extra flair. Sure, I can speak to the rock, but wouldn't it be more dramatic? Wouldn't I get the point across more if I make a bigger show and strike the rock with Aaron's staff like I had to do all those years before? But see, in this world, the rock of Messiah is our source and our strength. That is the good news of the gospel. We don't need to dress it up. We don't need to make it more dramatic. We don't need to spice it up with our flamboyance, our cleverness, our lights, or our show. But how many ministers and ministries feel like they have to do that these days? Make it a little fancier and do things like that. When in reality, if we really just did what he said, and proclaimed it, speak to the rock, That should be enough to bring forth the living water, shouldn't it? That should be enough to see the fruit of the gospel take place. How much damage do we do to ourselves? How much damage do we do to the message, to Messiah, when we try to strike the rock, rather than just speak to it or speak about him? When we disobey and we don't do what he says, how he says to do it. Now that's the passage here. This, look at verse 12 of chapter 20. It says, "But Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me, so as to esteem me as holy in the eyes of Bnei Israel, therefore you will not bring this assembly into the land that I have given to them." When you look over in, I'm missing that. Where did that go? In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 50, puts it like this. It says, "On the mountain that you are ascending to be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people, because you both broke faith with me among Bnei Israel at the waters of Meribah, the Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of Bnei Israel." So basically what he's saying, the Lord is accusing him that in doing that they were showing a lack of trust in him. They were breaking faith with him. They were not treating him as sometimes when we try to dress things up and make it more about us and what we're doing rather than him, we're not treating him as holy. We defame his name in the eyes of others, and we may even experience the consequences of that. Because of that, Moses, it says, he was not able to go into the land because they did not trust in him. So these are some of the pictures. The rock was Messiah. The rock is their provision of the living water. The rock was all of that for them. So that first picture was the red heifer to cleanse us from death. That ash is put in the water. That hyssop is used to sprinkle it around the tent or around the person. And it's a process very similar to Passover, when they would spread the blood of the lamb on the doorposts with their homes, using what kind of plant? They were using hyssop to do it, again. So that second picture, that living water from the rock, that Paul identified as Messiah. We are to provide living water for all who are thirsty by speaking to or speaking about the rock, calling out in the name of the rock of Messiah, Yeshua. Not striking or hindering or injuring, but proclaiming his name in spirit and in truth. That's who we are supposed to be in speaking to him. And this third picture is the picture of, in Exodus chapter 21, which is the bronze serpent on a pole. Okay, verse 1. It says, "When the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming along the road to Atharim, he attacked Israel and captured some of them. Then Israel vowed to Adonai and stated, 'If you deliver this people into our hand, we will put their cities under the ban of destruction.' And Adonai listened to Israel's plea and delivered up the Canaanites, and they put them and their cities under the ban of destruction. So the name of the place was called Hormah. And they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Sea of Reeds in order to go around the land of Edom. The spirit of the people became impatient along the way." Over 38 years they probably walked that way several times. But the people spoke against Moses, they spoke against God and Moses. "Why have you brought us from Egypt to die here in the wilderness? Because there's no bread, no water, and our very spirits detest the despicable food." So Adonai sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Then the people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against Adonai and you. Pray to Adonai for us, that he may take away the snakes." And so Moses prayed for the people. And Adonai said to Moses, "Make yourself a fiery snake and put it on a pole. Whenever anyone who has been bitten will look at it, he will live." And so Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. And it happened that whenever a snake bit anyone and he looked at the bronze snake, he lived. That was John chapter 4. That's what that reminded me of. Where he goes to her and says, give me a drink. And he says, everyone who drinks from this water will get thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I give him shall never be thirsty. The water I give him will become a fountain of water within him, springing up to eternal life. But Miriam has died, at the beginning of this. Aaron has died. They've left Mount Hor after 30 days of mourning, but in their impatience in all of this, they began to speak against God. They began to speak against Moses. They were remembering their way of life in Egypt, which, when you think about it, how many of them were actually in Egypt at this point? Hadn't most of them already died? So what they're remembering about Egypt is what they've been told. Or very vague memories, because they were younger. They wouldn't necessarily remember the details, or they might be remembering the reminiscence of those that were grumbling and complaining about things. But so most of them probably had never actually seen Egypt or life in Egypt. But they were rejecting God's provision that he has been giving them all those years of the bread and the quail. They even called it this despicable food. And so Adonai, it says, sent poisonous serpents among the people. And that he sent these fiery serpents, these poisonous serpents among the people. What's interesting is that the word that he uses there is not the same word of Genesis 3 and the serpent. The interesting thing, that word is nachash, which is Strong's number 5175. That's the word that is used there in Genesis 3. It also shows up later in this passage. Actually, the word that is used here is Strong's 8314, which is seraph, which I thought was pretty interesting. It's the same word that's used in Isaiah chapter 6 about the seraphs that were there around the temple or around the throne of God. That's a very different picture from what we typically think of as the serpents and the snakes. This is the burning one, and their strikes, cause this inflamed bite on things. But later, when you look at chapter 21, verse 7, it says, then the people came to Moses and said, we sinned when we spoke against Adonai, and you pray to us, Adonai, for us, that he may take away the snakes. And so Moses prayed for the people. The people asked for the nachash to be taken away. But in verse 8, Adonai said to Moses, make yourself a fiery snake and put it on a pole. Guess which one he used? He used this one. It's like, it's as if, God sends angels of judgment against the people, and they either can't see them for who they really are, or they think they are these serpents, these snakes. Like they're looking for, and I don't know if y'all know anybody who does that in the world today, but they're looking for a natural explanation, an earthly solution to a problem that can be fixed, rather than recognizing the spiritual problem that's going on, or the situation that's going on. They try to find the natural explanations for things and rule out the works and actions of God. Anybody know anybody like that, likes to do that? I've talked to many of them. Because if it's an earthly problem, if it's just regular snakes that are out there, then you can kill them, right? You can call an exterminator. You can move to a different place. Any one of those Israelites should be able to handle an earthly problem like that. An earthly problem can have an earthly fix. But this isn't just an earthly problem that they have, is it? This is a spiritual problem. And that problem, that issue, is dangerous. Like, they couldn't really recognize the trouble that they were in. They couldn't really recognize the danger. They couldn't avoid it. They couldn't kill it. They couldn't stop it. They couldn't do anything about it. because the problem wasn't just an earthly problem, it was a spiritual problem. See, I did that. Moses makes God uses the word seraph, Moses makes the bronze nachash, but a spiritual problem requires a spiritual solution. That's the basic thing. Does it really make sense if you're really having problems of snakes biting you and causing people to die? Does it really make sense to elevate a bronze snake of judgment on a pole in order to cure it? No. It doesn't really make sense to do that. If your doctor gave you a prescription like that for a snake bite, or a broken arm, or cancer, what would you think of your doctor? Would you have a high opinion of them? Probably not. But see, God does not act like a normal doctor. This is a spiritual problem. The problem is dangerous. Elevate a picture of judgment. Elevate this bronze serpent, this bronze snake up there, and all you have to do to be cured is to look at it. Whether you understand the whole thing or not, whether you understand how it works, all you have to do is look at it and live. And it makes me wonder about that. How many people, when they were bitten by the snake, because it didn't make sense to them, refused to even look, refused to believe, refused to look up at the pole that they could see, because that was not a sensible solution to what they thought was the problem. See, my problems are real here on earth, so don't talk to me about this spiritual issue. Don't talk to me about sin, about spiritual stuff, when there's so much suffering going on around us in our own life. Those are my big problems. They think the snakes are the problem. The earthly things are the problem, but their problem was really speaking against God and speaking against Moses. See, people, and you put in that people who believe in God or don't, politicians, governments, all those types of things, they think they can fix the world's problems of hunger, of suffering. They'll throw in climate change, healthcare, poverty, but all of their fixes are not going to address the real issue and the real problem, because the root of the problem is not something physical. The root of the problem is something spiritual. It's not earthly things, it's heavenly things. It's spiritual things that are the great problem. Yeshua had a conversation with somebody like that. In John chapter 3, he says, if you do not believe the earthly things I told you, how will you believe when I tell you about heavenly things? No one has gone up into heaven except the one who came down from heaven, the Son of Man. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Did Nicodemus understand all that stuff, or was he still kind of wrestling with it? He was trying to understand the nature of, what do you mean by being born again? I'm thinking physically here. How is that even possible? And Yeshua is on a completely different level. All you have to do is look to the Son of Man that's been lifted up. You look to the cross. You look what has been done on his behalf. Eternal life is actually very simple. You believe. You look to the Messiah. You trust in God's provision. Because God's solutions to the world's problems don't make sense to the world and the people who are unwilling to submit to God in his ways. When you look at these three pictures of the red heifer, of the rock, the living water from the rock, and the serpent that is lifted up, the red heifer makes no sense. We have a hard time coming to terms with it and understanding it. What does it mean? How does it work? What's the significance of it? The water doesn't just come from a rock just because you talk to it. Right? You're going to drill a well or do something else like that. Putting a serpent on a pole to cure a snake bite is malpractice. That's how the world understands and tries to make sense of God's solutions. But in all of these things, God's solution is being proclaimed. That is Messiah. Messiah is the answer. Messiah is the solution to all of the world's problems. And I fully believe that there were people then. They would not accept the ashes of the red heifer, and so they were cut off from the people. I don't believe there were people who would accept the water that came out of the rock. It had dust in it, or something else like that. I believe that there were even people who tried to talk those who had been bitten by the snake. They tried to talk them out of looking to the serpent on the pole. You need to come to a real doctor. All of these things are the battles are going on of faith. Are you going to trust what you think is best? Are you going to trust how you think it should work? Are you going to trust in the provision of God? Don't we still have people all around us that think exactly the same way? They grumble and complain against their situation. They grumble and complain against their suffering, their hardships, and all of those things. And you try to tell them that if you'll just go to what God has to say, if you just go to how He wants you to live, if you just go to His provision, you will be healed. And yet they don't want to go. They refuse to accept that. So that's the issue that we have. Do we accept their solutions to our problems, to their problems, to the world's problems, or are we going to live and walk by the solutions that God has provided? They don't always make sense. They're not always something that we would do naturally. But His ways are not our ways. And He provides what we need, not what we think. And I'm very thankful for that. I'm very thankful that He doesn't take our advice. I'm very thankful that He doesn't ask our opinion about how He should fix something, because we would have never come up with any of that. And this picture of what Messiah has done for us. So will we accept God's solutions?